Hey folks, welcome and thank you for joining us today on AI Explained. Today is on metrics to detect hallucinations. Um, let's just wait a minute or so for others to join. In the meantime, we have a little survey and we'd like to know what you're thinking about with respect to challenges with deploying generative applications. So please fill that out and we'll start up in about a minute or so. Hosts and panelists can't vote. That doesn't seem fair. All right, maybe 30 more seconds for stragglers. All right, so I think we're ready to blast off here. Welcome and thank you for joining us on today's AI Explained on metrics to detect hallucinations. This is kind of a fireside. I'm Josh Rubin, principal AI scientist at Fiddler AI. I'll be your host today. You can put your questions in the QA box at any time during the fireside, and we'll have a question section at the end. So, maybe at 35 or 40 past the hour, we'll cut over and start answering some questions. So we have a very special guest today on AI Explained, and that's Pradeep Javangula, Chief AI Officer at RagaAI. Welcome, Pradeep.
Hi, Josh. How's it going? Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation. So looking forward to this conversation.
So maybe before we jump to intros, I'm just looking at the poll questions here. I guess as advertised by the name of the fireside, hallucinations are really top of mind for people. But I don't know if you're looking at the responses also, but it looks like it's actually interesting to me that we had some coverage over all of the different questions that people are worried about. So latency, cost, privacy. But I think I would have probably predicted a distribution like this with some significant concern about safety and toxicity. It's certainly top of mind for us right now. So Pradeep, maybe you can do a quick introduction of yourself. And yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you, Josh. Appreciate the invitation, and thank you everyone for joining. So my name is Pradeep Javangula. I'm the Chief AI Officer for RagaAI. We are a comprehensive testing, validation, and verification sort of like product and service that we're sort of like a fledgling company that's been around for roughly about 2.5 years, and consisting of a variety of data scientists, machine learning engineers. My background is I've been in the Bay Area for lots of years. Since 1996, I often like to call it the dawn of the internet. I've been a founder of different companies, and I've been fortunate to be involved with many aspects of data science, machine learning platforms, primarily through search engines. So I used to be at a company called Ink2Me, which was a big web search engine before there was a Google. We used to power Yahoo, Microsoft, and AOL. And after that, started a computational advertising company and spent time at Adobe as the head of their ML and AI efforts, and at Workday and a variety of different domains. So enough of that. But yeah, like I said, it's like, so if you'd said 20 years ago that like, oh, this is the level of sort of interest and progress that we would have achieved with AI in 2024, I'd have been a bit surprised. But here we are. So it's all good.
Yeah, it's an amazing sort of resume for the stuff that you're doing now. I often point at Adobe as a sort of a really impressive organization for having mobilized AI, especially generative AI, for a lot of really valuable use cases. I think maybe more than most applications, Adobe's products now are benefiting from years invested in generating really powerful, useful generative AI tools. But I guess that's not so much the topic of today.
Perfect.
Right. So I think we're going to talk, at least start with hallucinations today. And I think as everyone is racing to roll out one kind of LLM or generative application or another, it's sort of this new paradigm of programming where the output is not particularly deterministic. So maybe we start with the obvious question. What's a hallucination anyway? And maybe why should people be worried about it?
Right. So I guess maybe it's a good idea to start at the beginning in terms of sort of like defining. First of all, I'm not a huge fan of the word hallucination as a way to describe the phenomenon that occurs when leveraging large language models or foundational models in terms of generating content, right? And so the generative AI terminology is probably a better sort of like use case for what this thing is, right? It is primarily, given that a large language model has been trained on a very large corpus of text, right, where there's some discerning and determination of what the underlying patterns are, it is attempting to predict sort of the next token, right, or the sequence of tokens, right? So depending on what the question is, what the prompt is, there is content that is being generated, and in the content that is being generated, it is maintaining a certain level of fidelity to quote unquote facts or actual truth is something that a large language model has no sense of. Right? It has no idea that it is actually spewing out something that is sort of like appears statistically, stochastically as the next logical token to show up. So because of that, you would end up with text or images or multimodal sort of like output that is generated that doesn't jive with the truth. Therefore, it appears to be making stuff up. Right? And that's what's sort of like basically referred to as hallucination. And as you rightly pointed out, so the risks associated with producing something that is untruthful or something that is not sort of like grounded in reality have adverse implications that really do need to be addressed. So, which is, I guess, the reason why 70% of our audience says hallucinations is our number one problem, right? Yeah, so I would define hallucination as basically the generated content not being grounded in truth, not being grounded in anything that is actually contextually relevant, right? And so it'll often appear to be that this thing that's on the other side, the model that's on the other side, is producing arbitrary content. So we can call it.
Yeah.
In some circles, it is actually considered a feature, not a bug, right? Because it's actually speculating and it is sort of like generating things that a normal human would probably not do. So, it's not a scientific or mathematical definition, but there it is.
Yeah, right. I think the kind of fundamental misunderstanding here is sort of that a large language model or a generative AI application it is by definition supposed to be doing something sort of factual and well constrained, like computer software usually does. And it's sort of like making stuff up in one flavor or another in a sort of statistically justified way is sort of the nature of the beast, right? So, instead of programming where it's sort of this additive process where you're building things that behave in a well-specified way, it's a little more like sculpting, right? Where you start with something that has this behavior of doing plausible, statistically grounded stuff, and then sort of carving away the bad behaviors to get at something that's a little bit more appropriate for a specific business application or whatever application. Another kind of related concept that I think is interesting are sometimes it can be factually correct, but sort of contextually inappropriate, right? Like
That's
if you're a business, you don't so much want, if you're an airline, you don't want your customer service chatbot giving medical advice, right? Even if that's kind of baked into the brain of the chatbot. There's also this very related, interesting sort of issue of, constraining the model to be sort of context appropriate or policy following. Some of those things we do with kind of fine tuning, but a lot of LLM development happens through prompting. Anyway, and basically asking the model for what you want.
that's well put.
So
Really well put. Yes.
yeah. So I don't know. Do you want to maybe you can say something about how Raga AI thinks about sort of uh, evaluating these things,
Yeah.
like how do you measure this, and in a sort of business specific
First,
way?
maybe it's like a brief introduction to Raga AI would be
Sure.
appropriate, right? Meaning that, first of all, we serve sort of the enterprise community, meaning that enterprises that are building applications that are AI enabled or AI driven, either for consumers or for other businesses. So it's essentially B2B, sort of like is our primary orientation. So in that context, as you rightly pointed out, unless you are an OpenAI or Anthropic or someone else that is building sort of like general purpose things that are aimed at everybody, most enterprises are leveraging these large language models of different stripes for the purposes of solving specific problems, conversational agents, or some sort of reasoning agents, or workflow agents, or insight deliverers based off of their enterprise corpus, whatever that corpus may be. It could be large volumes of text, it could be some structured data, it could be image data, and so on. So Raga AI is primarily involved with attempting to figure out what your problems are in a machine learning or an AI app development cycle. And our primary focus is pre-deployment, although there's some overlap with Fiddler and other companies in terms of like what we end up doing on the inference side as well. Primarily, we look at what we deliver as a platform to deal with data issues, model issues, and the operational issues. Right? So meaning that as you are contemplating on building a RAG application or building a much more of a classical machine learning application, what is the level of rigor that you apply with respect to sampling, with respect to the segmentation between test and train, or train and test, and figuring out how well your model is performing with a certain level of all the metrics that data scientists care about: precision, recall, rock curves, and all sorts of things. And think of sort of like a suite of tests that we deliver to the developers or to the machine learning engineers or to data scientists that they wouldn't have to hand code, but given data, given model, and given some sort of like inference input, we would assess and we'll tell you sort of like where things are. Right. So that's the thrust of like what we're doing. And as a consequence of like what we do, we kind of have to plug ourselves into the stream of the application development lifecycle. Right? So the ML or the AI app development lifecycle. So we end up often being asked to sort of like deliver on compliance and governance oriented sort of like solutions in specific verticals. And I should also point out that this problem of being able to detect all problems and point to the root causes of like what's causing those problems is highly non-trivial, number one. Number two, it is very verticalized in nature, right? Mm-hmm. And so we by no means are claiming that we've solved sort of all problems for all verticals for all times, right? So, and on top of that, our ecosystem continues to evolve very rapidly and very quickly. So our focus has been on specific verticals. So we've started out with computer vision and then expanded to sort of like large language models and text, and we also have support for structured data sets. So that's what we are. So maybe I actually missed out on the question you asked. So yes. So
I lost track of it already.
So pre-deployment is is our primary focus. So to probe into the application development lifecycle with respect to data and model and identify issues.
Nice. I can relate to your sentiment about the challenges associated with, drilling down and finding problems and offering remediations. I think, sort of the first step is, and maybe I'd be interested in, your perspective on this, but I think we sort of see a first step as observability, right? Like, can you characterize how well the thing works? For us, we pay a lot of attention to, production time. Has the world changed in some way? Has some new topic emerged? It's a problem. Uh, you know, the first step is like, having some sort of comprehensive observability into the performance of the model by some number of dimensions. Um, you know but of course that's not enough, right? A customer, what we hear all the time is, okay, you've told us there's an issue, but that only gets us halfway there. Like, where do we take this? um so I don't know if you have any thoughts around that, or we can maybe
Yeah,
uh,
and
move on a little bit.
like I said, this is a hard problem. Right? As I said, ultimately, sort of like an application is evaluated in terms of how well is or how satisfactory its functionality is as discerned by the user, right? But we can know something about how well it's being received or how satisfactory the responses are from sort of like inference data, right? Which is what you guys do an amazing job of, and try to point to sort of like other interpretability or explainability aspects of sort of like what's going on. But then you want to take it all the way back, right? Meaning that, how do I remediate this, right? In what way should I change my training data set so that it's much more uniformly representative of the kind of model that I ought to be building, right? How much of a drift is there? How much of sort of like failure mode analysis is actually occurring? So how do you deal with things like active learning, right? So this is what
Mm,
basically the community refers to as active learning. It is taking what's happening out in production and identifying the things that you ought to do in terms of improvement, or a continuous sort of like improvement in terms of trying to make that happen. And often it is gated by how much sort of like volume do you have, right? It's like, it would be great if we could have sufficient traffic to be able to sort of distribute it across a swath of models. It could be like just an A/B test, or it could be sort of like an ABCD test, or even multivariate testings on for different sort of like champion challenger models out in production. So that would be probably the best way to deal with it. But often you are dealing with sort of like one at a time, and then you are trying to come back to some corrective or remediation measures. So given that we're involved in the core of their sort of like development pipeline, so the development life cycle, we have observed what they did, how they've labeled, for instance, if it is a supervised learning use case, how well they have labeled things, and what labeling inaccuracies may be, and using very methodical statistical measures about in and out of distribution of the training data set, right? And of looking at the time series evolution of the metrics, of the different types of sort of like model metrics, and even of multiple models to be tested on the specific data set and so on. So that's the kind of thing that we do. And given that we also follow sort of the lineage of the data as it gets processed through, right?
mm,
And like I said, that's why it's like, there's an overlap between what Fiddler does and what Raga does from the perspective of sort of like observability. In general, I would even argue that what we do should be called observability as well. But then, that it is what it is, right? So,
to my taste, I'm happy to call you observability also.
but that's fine.
Okay, my questions are I'm keeping notes, and they're
No
they're
problem.
branching in a very many different branches in a nonlinear way. So I'm trying to let me see how I want to slice this.
Sure.
Um, so one question that's sort of interesting to me is, when we think about things like basic, classifier metrics, precision recall, area under the curve, that kind of stuff. Um, I'm curious how the large language model is different for you. So often when we're thinking about things like active learning, gosh, yesterday we were discussing a problem with a hard classification use case, and there's this old paper from Facebook research, this focal loss paper where they figured out a bunch of stuff for computer vision models. But basically, by asking the model during its training to take the cases where it was unsure more seriously than the easy cases. So with an adjustment to the loss function that causes it to sort of get really good at things it finds challenging, or really focus on things it gets challenging. So I guess maybe one question for you is how is the generative AI or large language model world, how is that different from a sort of, you may not be training these models, right? You might not be fine tuning. Um, and what knobs do you have for, do you think about in terms of, ways to improve an underperforming model?
Right. So firstly, in the enterprise scenario, and I'll limit my comments to sort of like the enterprise, the
Sure.
general types of use cases, right? So the most predominant of LLM adoptions are really happening in terms of retrieval augmented generation use cases, right? And the LLM is largely being called upon to generate, summarize, to sort of like to provide an answer that isn't a blue link like in a web search scenario with some sort of like a snippet that surrounds it, but much more about a summarization of a set of results that are appropriate to the prompt that has been given. So given that that's the primary use case that we see, right? In terms of sort of like these foundational models being deployed, you basically start the world with your context, right? Meaning your context DB or the corpus that is relevant to the kind of RAG application that you want to develop, right? And you go through a variety of sort of like embedding generations of those documents and put them into a vector DB, and then you go through yet another sequence of steps that allow for a user to be somewhat guided through a set of prompts that are relevant to the domain or the context in question, right? And hopefully you can apply a variety of sort of personalization techniques as well, knowing who the user is or what they're attempting to do and so on. And then from a response perspective, you want to leverage the results of such retrieval mechanism to be summarized in a cohesive manner, depending on what your style of choice is. Now, so what are the potential problems that could occur? Right? So first is, I would call coherence, right? So, we were just jumping into sort of like the metrics associated with
Yeah,
what could
love it.
cause hallucination, right? And so the things that could cause hallucination, first of all, it's like, hallucination needs to be expected, right? And so what you want to do is to try and figure out how much hallucination is likely to have happened. And that requires a reasonable amount of rigor as far as your quality assessment process is concerned. And to the extent possible, like you pointed out, have kind of hard guardrails about sort of like, I don't want to answer a question about politics or about healthcare if this is a customer service bot, or
Right.
or or something to that effect. Right? So coherence is really sort of the measure of complexity of the generated text, right? Meaning that the hallucinated text may actually exhibit a high level of perplexity due to sort of like inconsistencies or kind of nonsensical sequences. Now, the quote unquote notion of nonsense is really a human judgment thing, right? Which is the reason why what you want to do is to surface something like a perplexity metric and allow for a human to be able to figure out what's going on, right? So now, if in response to a given prompt, the probability of such perplexity arising is really high, then really sort of, given that we don't often have sort of like the innards of a model of an LLM that we are leveraging, we might just want to back off, right? Saying it's like, look, I am not trained to answer this question, or that, so you do some sort of like a boilerplate response in order to make that happen. Yes, it's not a particularly satisfactory answer, but like, so there are potentially other ways of dealing with it in terms of maybe you meant this, right? In terms of, and since we are dealing with these sort of like large dimensional vectors, we can always think about things that are within its neighborhood according to a kind of metric. So one is sort of like perplexity. That's, among the coherence sub bucket, I would put perplexity. Second is word overlap, right? Meaning comparing the generated text with reference corpus. I mean, I'll often go back to, so the reference corpus being sort of like quote unquote the ground truth, or us being able to evaluate upfront how closely it matches up with the corpus that is being used is one of the most sort of like foolproof ways of dealing with it. I've seen less instances of this. Sort of third element inside of coherence is basically grammar and syntax. So
Mhm.
I think all of these large language models seem to be just almost impeccable in terms of the grammar with which they generate. It seems like really hard to detect cases where it is the case. But I did see some cases where it's no, I wouldn't write that. That's not sort of like
Right.
English. And not in that model. So that's sort of like one big bucket of coherence.
Mhm.
Second bucket, I would say, is basically fact checking, right? Which is assuming that everything that you fed into your context DB is the truth. This is your facts, and this is the enterprise's facts or the data scientist facts. Knowing knowing that, and understanding or analyzing that corpus sufficiently, or prepping that corpus sufficiently with all sorts of techniques. And I've seen people do named entity recognitions or knowledge
Mhm.
graph building or other forms of sort of like embedding generations that are true to that specific domain. These are all things that are important, and which will guide in terms of saying it's like, of the response that was emitted, how do I actually effectively compare it against the context that was provided? And, in a pure mathematical geeky sense, you can think of it purely in terms of distance, or in terms of nearness, or other ways of thinking of it from a classical sort of like NLP perspective, right? So that's sort of like fact checking. And so, semantic coherence, semantic consistency is also another thing that I would point to as an important part, which is that there's, like both of us were pointing out, that this is basically a stochastic parrot, right? It's attempting to generate larger and larger sequences of words that cohere with some level of semantic discipline or linguistic discipline, but the semantic nature of the content that is being generated can often be weird. It's like, I've seen responses where sort of like first paragraph and second paragraph are completely unrelated to each other. It's like,
Mhm.
what are you doing? Right? And we're put in this sort of like this awkward place, Josh, right? Where there's this thing called the foundational model. We don't know what all went into training, and specifically not even mostly familiar with the types of things that go into the weights or the corpus that is associated with it. So we can control what we can control, and therefore the things that we can control are the corpus, and like you said, sort of like guardrails and other sorts of things that make sense. So those are sort of like and there are a few others like contextual understanding and having some form of human evaluation, which is some level of human evaluation up front in the development process, is
Yeah.
the thing that's kind of clearly important, right? So it's like, if you don't spend sufficient amount of time on that front, then one can end up in a place where it's like, well, we don't know how it's going to behave in the wild, right? And that's when Fiddler is brought in saying, it's like, explain to me what's going on here.
Yeah. Well, this is that question gets hard with the large models, of course, and I think all the frontier labs would agree.
I
um,
agree with that.
so I guess and maybe you've already sort of touched on this, but one question I would ask about these kind of evaluations are, human feedback, simple statistical models, uh, simple-ish classifier models? Do you evaluate with a large language model? Is it models all the way down? How I just be curious to hear about how you think about this. Who's responsible for the eval? I know that we're always encouraging our customers to build human feedback into the loop as much as possible, because it's sort of the gold standard, right? If you can find out that human beings were actually disappointed by what happened, that's treasure, but not always so easy.
Right. So the question was, how would
the question was, where do you, what kinds of tools do you use, for, is it really the whole spectrum? Maybe the answer is just yes. From simple statistics, some of those things like that you mentioned, like word overlap, right? Those are nice metrics because you can compute them very quickly, right? Among other things. First, it follows the keep it simple rule. It's effective, but it's also fairly computationally inexpensive, right? But some of these problems we can address with other big models.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's sort of like, tread carefully would be my high level guidance, right? And the thing is, it is the evaluating your application in concert with an LLM is first size and data sufficiency problem, right? Just in terms of, so like what kind of corpus do you have? Does it have the types of things that can effectively answer the questions that you want, right? And back in the day, I used to run sort of like enterprise search engines, and this is it's very similar to that part of the use case, except that sort of like in that case, just like web search, we would just return documents with sort of like snippets, and it's a bit of an unsatisfactory thing where there is no state that's maintained, where there is no dialogue involved, there are no aspects of personalization that can be employed, and so on. So I think we're in a different era of enterprise search and enterprise retrieval. So I would argue that that knowing what your data looks like and how well you prep the data for the purposes of the retrieval application that you're providing is going to go a long way in terms of eliminating sort of like this strange hallucinatory effects. That's number one. And I think, and you guys do this too, sort of like, or other observability platforms do this, just in terms of sort of like bias detection and mitigations. And there are classical approaches of trying to figure out sort of like whether there exists bias, sensitive variables, and PHI and PII data, and other sorts of that nature. And, but when I first sort of like met the Fiddler founding team back in like 2019, I was thoroughly impressed with the sort of like tremendous focus that you guys had on explainability. I was at Workday at the time, and we'd done multiple sort of like POCs with your team in terms of trying to arrive at explainability as it relates to compliance with employment law.
Yeah.
Many of our lawyers and the security officers were sort of like mystified by like, this, your application, your machine learning application appears to be doing reasonably well. However, what did you use, right? What kind of data did you leverage in order to make that happen? And sort of the what if scenarios of, if I took this stuff out, or if I suppress this variable or this feature and so on, what would it do to the overall model? So that I think is actually important. Diversity of model evaluation is something that I would definitely take. And to your point, right, it is sometimes it's helpful to sort of like simply say, look, if I was a human attempting to sort of like answer this question, is there a methodical process that I can actually write down? It might involve some mathematics, it might involve some computations and some statistical evaluations in terms of trying to make that happen. And attempting to see if your overall AI application, whether it's reasoning or whether it is generating and so on, adheres to some such sort of like simpler world would make sense. And what you pointed out is actually quite appropriate as well, meaning that just start with sort of like a linear regression, it's okay. So perturb one of these features, right, sufficiently and try to fit a linear model against it, and then figure out what your overall responses look like in relation to that sort of like smaller space, right? Yeah, so there's a bunch of other stuff. I mean, it's like, and the beauty of this stuff is like the level of research that's going on in this domain is really strong, and actually trying to keep up with what's going on is itself a hard problem, right? Like you pointed out, the Meta paper, the Facebook paper has been around for a while, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff, and
Oh, it's absolutely, it's a fire hose. I think a fire hose is an understatement for the rate at which new stuff is happening.
that's very true,
Um,
very true.
very challenging.
Right.
Um, just a sort of a side comment that I think is related to,
Please.
uh, I'm a bit of a measurement fanatic, and we've talked about sort of rigor in sort of measurement and characterization. Um, the other end of the spectrum from the keeping it simple solutions to evaluation is depending on models of one kind or another, maybe even having, in some cases, large language models do some of that hallucination eval, ask the question, is this model response faithful to the context that was provided to it, right? These models can reason in very sophisticated ways. And, to my taste, if you're going to go to that length to evaluate in those kinds of complex, sophisticated ways, then there's also a kind of a question of characterizing how well those tools work at evaluation. Like there's this sort of meta evaluation level is, if I'm going to bring in some large language model based system for evaluating my application, then, whoever the provider of that is, whether it's developed in-house or some third party application, you might ask to see how well that model is characterized on some public data where you can verify, it might not be sufficient for the lawyers who are worried about, the corner case where it's going to do something bad. But if you can say something sort of quantitative about the performance of, you know, a model evaluator for other models, I think that actually goes a long way to sort of building trust and confidence
Exactly.
in a sophisticated set of
Exactly. In fact, that's actually
evaluations.
what we do.
Yeah.
Our platform is really sort of like on the modeling side of it is actually a model evaluator, and you can use sort of like an adversarial approach, right? So you have your model, which can be a black box to our sort of like testing platform, and then we can challenge it with another model to try and
Mhm.
determine what the fidelity of the responses look like. And it's a legitimate technique, right? It's like, the in terms of being able to champion challenge this, and the other approach that you pointed out is also something that we use, which is that, because of our testing platform, and our goal is to be embedded in the development cycle, so we really don't follow the classical sort of like SaaS model, right? In the sense that we install or allow our applications to be deployed in a native environment for a specific client, right? So, and given that that's the case, since we have to show stuff about like what we do, we often leverage open source data sets, right? From AR, VR, or from sort of like publicly available sort of like corpus, or medical data or medical imaging data. Those are actually harder to come by, but like news feeds or Reddit or other sorts of things in order to show off what our actual platform does. And that's a good enough, in my opinion, way to evaluate whether your model evaluator or this meta level thing that you're talking about is going to be useful to your purpose or not.
Nice. Yeah, yeah. No, I think we're in a similar boat in how we train and evaluate the tools that we use. So probably in the next few minutes we should to cut over to questions. But I had a couple more little things that were interesting to me, and so maybe we try to address those in the next 5 minutes, and then we give
No
our
problem.
audience a chance to type some questions in if they haven't already, and then we'll jump over to the questions. Um, so one question is, do you think about this hallucination evaluation from the perspective of like, is it a model developer problem, or do you think about the business user in like there's all these different stakeholders and organizations, and one question we get often is like, who's sort of your end user, right? Like, and to what degree are they worried about the same things? Do you think about, you know, is that a distinction that you think about? Like, certain metrics being of more interest to business users, where like sort of KPI oriented metrics versus, um, you know, the sort of strict sciencey metrics that a model developer might be interested in. Does that factor
Yeah,
into your thinking about?
no, that makes sense. That actually makes sense. And I think, I don't know if it's necessarily about which metrics are more relevant to business users and so on. Ultimately, everyone cares about the quality of the application and the satisfactory thing that it is delivering, right? So, the I would approach the sort of product management or the business team in terms of saying, it's like, how do you characterize success for this application? Start at that highest level. And of course, they have other metrics in terms of, well, potentially we're making our overall organization that much more productive, or that we're enabling a certain level of transparency, right? And so people measure, for instance, these RAG-oriented applications in terms of the diversity of questions that are being answered effectively, and to some extent, sort of the productivity that this thing is actually enabling in terms of emitting an answer, right? I'm speaking from experience in terms of sort of what we're encountering in many of these application scenarios. So the product managers or the business executives are largely interested in the 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 fidelity of the application and the usage of the application and the kind of satisfaction that is being derived from it, right? Which are one set of metrics, right? Just
Mhm.
of like, even if you do sort of an inline survey about did this really answer your question, or then you can also have a slightly deeper measure in terms of, in order to answer this question, I needed to retrieve a response from like three distinct data sets that were not always interlinked to each other, but you somehow correlated all of those things and emitted a coherent response. And those are the types of things that people are using to evaluate. On the data scientist side, given that I'm a math geek like you,
Mhm.
so we probably end up being much, much more rigorous in terms of actual quantitative things that are involved. I mean, whether it be distance metrics, Hall-Nobis distance, or sort of like, the levels of clustering that's involved, or the types of models and algorithms that are being leveraged, how comprehensive were the number of models that you use to evaluate, and then back on to sort of the things that you guys do in terms of, Shapley values or integrated gradients or other forms of ways of explainability. Those are the types of things that I have seen data scientists and machine learning engineers obsess over more, which is fine. I think that's what you should do.
Yeah, for me, I would say that kind of most commonly used, I mean, it really, in this LLM world more than the explainability metrics, since that's such a challenging problem right now. One of the most useful things is, semantic similarity. It's the same thing that sort of undergirds the vector search, right? It's converting prompts and responses into a mathematical representation that where proximity represents semantic similarity, um, because that ends up helping to localize common failure modes.
Exactly.
If you can identify where a bunch of problems are happening and you realize there's some semantic commonality, like this is, you know, questions that have to do with this particular topic often have a hallucination problem, or often our users thumbs down the response, right? That's an incredibly powerful diagnostic tool. Um,
Absolutely.
so Um, okay, so I'm going to maybe jump to a question here, and I think
So,
you covered maybe some of this, but the first question is: there are many types of hallucination scores for evaluation and monitoring. How should each be used?
um, let's see. Did the evaluation metrics ought to be used first in terms of, like I said, detecting things such as perplexity,
Hmm.
determining a sense of sort of like how contextually relevant they are, how semantically relevant they are, and what level of semantic consistency is being achieved, right? So, we can characterize each LLM application with those metrics in tow, then you can be reasonably confident about how well your thing is going to perform out in production. So I know it's a very general purpose 30,000 foot level answer, but that's where we are.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Um, let's see, what do we have also?
What have you seen, by the way? I'm curious to hear your
Oh,
on that front, just in terms of this, like, how have you seen sort of like these metrics being leveraged or utilized?
yeah. I mean, people want hallucination detection. We hear that a lot. This is not going to be a surprise given
Yeah,
the title of this and what do you call it? The survey from the beginning, right? Um, we talk to a lot of potential customers and our existing customers who, really want something sort of ironclad with high classification capability, and oftentimes we turn to things like, in the literature now, people talk about, um, uh, you know, response faithfulness. Does this answer faithfully reflect the information that was in the context provided to the model, right?
yeah.
Um,
So I
and
was
that
going
breaks down even further
contextual.
into questions like, you know, is there a conflict with the information inside
That's right.
the context, or is it just baseless made up additional stuff, right? So
Right.
baselessness versus conflict is a sort of a nuanced metric. And then there's also relevance, and I think this touches on a lot of the things that you were, mentioning. And some of these, this is, you can use things like, traditional statistical metrics. There are things like Blue and Rouge that were developed like, I
Rouge
think
is an
20 years ago that
interesting
are
name.
sort of these, and these. So the question of like, what does this response may be factual, it may be grounded, but did we answer the user question?
Right.
Um, the other one that I think is hot is LLM aside, did my retrieval mechanism pull up the information that was relevant? So context relevance, right? Um,
Right.
so like, sometimes, you know, and this, I think in some ways this gets into sort of production monitoring, right? If there's a topic shift in the world, if all of a sudden one of your customers starts asking, they see something in the news and they start asking your chatbot a question that is not present in your vector
Represented. Yeah,
database,
that's right. Yes.
suddenly you might on one random day start missing a lot of opportunities to give a good answer just because you didn't know that the users were, you know, asking about the Taylor Swift concert in your town, or whatever, make up your story, right? Uh, so being able to quickly identify whether there's a problem
Yeah.
in your content, either in your database or in the way that your database is configured to retrieve documents, like the chunking or the embedding model.
Right.
So I don't know. This gets a little bit nuanced, but I think all of those things are important. All instrumenting all of the different pieces of this LLM application. It's not just about the generative model.
Right.
Um,
No, it's a really good point.
let's
It's a really good point. And, we used to run into this problem all the time, even
yeah.
back in sort of like the early 2000s and so on, where first of all, this notion of sort of like how contextually relevant are you was a problem that existed even before, and evaluating the quality of your application in the context of a changing universe, the types of questions
Mm,
that are being asked, or the corpus itself morphing itself pretty dramatically. I think Google's done a phenomenal job of this stuff over the years, and so like the suite of techniques that they leverage, from everything from knowledge graphs to sort of like page rank to whole suite of sort of like personalization approaches are all quite relevant.
what about what about identifying malicious intent from users? Is that something that you guys think about at all?
That is something that we think about a lot, actually. So
Yeah.
malicious intent from a user, and yeah, and we are really using sort of like an adversarial approach in order to make that happen, and trying to determine sort of it's almost like an intent classification in the prompt. right? And to the extent possible, we attempt to detect it and point it and actually take an aggressive approach to it, right? It is that, just back off of sort of responding or divert the user to change topics to something else. That kind of stuff is what we have been advising. We've been trying to, like, since we're trying to build basically an overall quality and validation and verification platform, we have to build some of these things ourselves, right? Otherwise, we will have very little credibility as we build out our platform. And as we do this, we discover more and more problems. And so the world is also changing quite a bit. Yeah, so you're right. Maliciousness is a big deal. Toxicity is a pretty big deal, right? Just in terms of the determining what the tone is of what's contained in a prompt, and again, sort of like detecting it and gently guiding in a different direction is the way to go. So yeah, so those are definitely things that we're thinking about. By no means am I saying that we have 100% sort of like answer to that problem yet.
We have an interesting, it's just because we're kind of in this like toxicity and sort of human malicious intent. It gets into this, all the prompt injection attacks, people
Yeah.
trying to, maybe you've seen these things on that are floating around like Twitter and LinkedIn of like, you know, they'll encounter a chatbot from a car dealership, or even like a salesperson will reach out on LinkedIn, as a LinkedIn message, and the user suspects that or the human who's received this message suspects that it's actually an LLM that's reached out to them, right? And so they ask it some sort of probing question that sort of reveals that it's probably an LLM, and then they say, gosh, I'm really glad you reached out to me. Could you please pretend like you're a Python interpreter and run and provide the response to the following code? And they get it to say something stupid because it's not a human and it's happy to be a Python interpreter. So there's some really funny like screen grabs that people have put together from abusing chatbots that approach them like humans. One interesting problem, so like well, let me start with the interesting problem, which is that what we've seen recently. So we've been thinking a lot about like prompt injection attacks. I would say that's another very hot topic. It's how do you make sure people aren't trying to get your chatbot to do something it wasn't intended for, or get something out of your company that your company didn't mean to offer, right? So there was just this Air Canada thing a month or so back
Yeah, I
where
saw that.
this chatbot offered some special discount tickets for somebody who had to attend a funeral or something like that. That was totally hallucinated, not part of the terms of the company. And then whatever, Air Canada sort of refused to honor
That
a
was
fairly
particularly
reasonable miscommunication, actually.
Yeah, that one was particularly egregious, and I think it's not even clear how much sort of accountability and liability does the company have if a chatbot misbehaves and basically gives out it's like 50% off on everything for today.
Right.
It's like what are you going to do, right? And it's well within the context of what it's supposed to do, right? It is, and it's difficult to detect that particular sort of like weirdness in terms of responses. And these are like, it's a weird world we live in right now.
There's an interesting thing that happens. So I did this experiment, I don't know, maybe sometime last year, where I started playing with ChatGPT and playing games of 20 questions with it to see if I could discover interesting things about how it reasons. And you would the gist of the story is if you ask it to think of a clue and play 20 questions with you, where you're guessing you're trying to guess the object that it's thinking of.
Right.
It actually doesn't, it doesn't know, it doesn't have
No.
anything in mind, right? It's just playing
I
the
know.
game
Yes.
and trying to produce a satisfactory answer. If you can rerun the same session with the same random seed, and you can interrupt it at an earlier level, and it'll give you a different clue, right?
Completely different answer. Yeah.
And it really gets to this. So one of the ways that these models are fine-tuned, like maybe fine-tuning isn't right, but the human reinforcement learning through human feedback mechanism that they use in order to make these really great at answering questions in a way that humans like. There's this theory that it also there's this that the model is doing this thing they call reward hacking. Basically, it's finding ways to make humans happier with its answers.
Mhm.
And there's a benefit to that, which it gets to be good at answering human, questions in satisfying ways. But a side effect, people think, is that this sort of confident but wrong answers
Right.
get enhanced, right? Because humans are often compelled by confidence over
Yeah.
factuality. The human doesn't know the difference, right?
Yep.
And so, and it leads to these interesting things like a sort of bias to say yes versus say no, right? Like so it actually turns out that then you can at home do these experiments yourself. It's fairly easy to get to basically lead an LLM to a kind of answer that you want or a kind of behavior you want by offering it yes versus no options, assuming it'll mostly take the yes path.
Mm.
But you can actually guide them quite a bit with fairly simple tricks where you're sort of exploiting the fact that they're trying to make humans happy. Um,
I have been thoroughly unimpressed with any sort of plannings that these generative models do, right? And I've been reading a bunch of papers. It's a huge area of interest for me, right?
yeah.
And not just for Raga, it's been so for a while. I've always thought that sort of these the neural nets and the deep learning approaches, starting with sort of image nets, have a certain sort of upper bound in terms of how far they can go beyond a certain level. So I'm more of a sort of a bit of a healthy skeptic of
Yeah.
the approach itself, essentially yielding all sorts of machine reasoning in some form or shape. So I'm probably more of a fan of Gary Marcus, right? Who thinks of sort of knowledge graphs and knowledge representation and grounded in fact being combined together with
Mhm.
statistical approaches. I'm not suggesting that the large language models are not doing sort of just amazing things, right? Just blow you away sometimes, just in terms of
Yep.
what it seems to be doing from a planning perspective about sort of planning a trip or sort of doing some of these agentic stuff that they're attempting to do. But still sort of in specific domains, whether it be sort of an industrial domain or in a healthcare domain or much more of a regulated domain, things are much more haywire.
Yeah. I think the thing that I feel a lot of those opinions myself. I think a thing to be mindful of is that things that behave like humans, humans are sort of hardwired to perceive as humans, right? Like, and so in a way, we're sort of hacking ourselves, right? There's a vulnerability when we make human-like things, especially when we know that they do have these fairly significant limitations.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so I think we're kind of rolling up on the hour. I don't know if you had any more sort of parting thoughts about sort of you know
Yeah. So
uh,
I think, yeah. So I mean, my part of it, first of all, is this is a very great conversation, pleasant conversation, and it's been fun to hang out and sort of pontificate for the most part about sort of what's going on with this sort of LLM world. I think this particular evolution is going really fast, and it's the pressure that is coming on data scientists and machine learning engineers from all quarters to be able to deploy these things, just at least to show off that we are generating Gen AI, is something that I think one should all have a healthy level of skepticism for. Just as with every sort of software application or tool and so on. So this is, be careful with respect to sort of how you go about doing this, what the right infrastructure choices are that you ought to deploy, careful selection of the context corpus that is going to be needed, and determining what things are important. Like, for some of the questions that I'm seeing is is toxicity important? Yeah, I think it's toxicity is super important, especially if it's consumer facing. It can have a very adverse impact on your brand, and you don't want that to happen, right? And similarly, sort of as much as possible, pay attention to sort of attributability, or basically citations, right? When it is generating responses, expose as much of sort of how you have built the application without sort of like intimidating the user, which are like, here's how I generated my response, here's why I think this is truthful, and so on, will go a long way toward establishing credibility. So and be willing to say, it's like, look, this is a chatbot. Its basic core nature is to be this stochastic parrot that will generate stuff. Therefore, there will be things that are not truthful or not factual or not sort of like are incoherent, and in which case it's like, take the sort of the caveat should actually be that, hey, I can make errors. It's a perfectly fine thing to do, and fall back on a human to be able to answer the question if it is sort of like truly mission critical. So anyway, so that's my general refrain.
That's wonderful. I think we'll stop here.
Thanks.
So thanks a lot, Pradeep. This was a super
Thank you,
easy
Josh.
hour
Really
to chat.
appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity. Bye, everyone.